They were the architects of joy, creators of the songs that lit up dance floors and stitched themselves into the soul of an entire generation. But behind the shimmer of sequins and disco lights was a quiet, almost invisible man, Benny Andersson. He wasn't the face of ABBA. He wasn't the voice. Yet without him, there would be no ABBA. And for 50 years, he never said how much it really cost him. Because while the world danced, Benny was silently falling apart, slowly, methodically, under the weight of genius, emotional repression, and a lifetime of being misunderstood. This is not the ABBA story you think you know. This is the story of its emotional core, and the man who spent a lifetime pouring his feelings into songs because he didn't know how to speak them out loud. Let's go back to the beginning, before the Eurovision stage, before the glitter boots and global charts. Benny Andersson was a Swedish boy with an accordion and a church choir. His music was not built in stadiums. It was born in kitchens, forests, and old cathedrals. He grew up in a home where feeling too much wasn't always welcomed. But when he touched a piano, the silence cracked open. His early influences, folk harmonies, sacred choral music, and classical precision, formed what he later called his emotional scaffolding. He wasn't just composing. He was constructing emotional blueprints. Every chord meant something. Every silence had weight. It's what made his songs timeless and what made him different from everyone else in the band. Because while Agnetha and Frida brought fire to the stage, Benny brought gravity, and it wasn't always noticed. When ABBA finally exploded onto the global stage, the spotlight turned to the singers. Magazine covers, TV appearances, paparazzi. It was dazzling and completely disorienting. But Benny? He stayed behind the curtain. He was the fixer, the listener, the one tweaking harmonies at 3 a.m. while everyone else slept, the one whispering, "Let's try it again," when a chord didn't quite feel right. He didn't chase perfection for the sake of it. He was chasing a feeling. The music had to match what was inside of him, even if no one else could hear it. And for years, no one really did. He watched as the world fell in love with the faces of ABBA, while he was quietly constructing the emotional soul of the band. And it wore on him. He once said, "I didn't need to be famous. I just wanted to be understood." But being the man behind the music came with its own invisible weight. Whenever conflict threatened the group, Benny was the one stepping in to hold things together. Not just musically, but emotionally. When Bjorn and Agnetha's marriage collapsed, and later his own relationship with Frida began to break, Benny didn't explode. He didn't confront. He retreated into the studio, into the chords, into the one place where feelings could be managed, not felt. While the tabloids speculated and fans picked sides, Benny buried his heartbreak under multi-track recordings and echo chambers. He didn't speak about the pain. He scored it. The haunting melodies of The Winner Takes It All, the loneliness of One of Us, the quiet ache in slipping through my fingers. These weren't just songs. They were unspoken letters, emotions he couldn't say aloud, transformed into music he could control. And that control, it became his lifeline, but it also became his cage. Because the more he wrote, the less he could feel in real life. His relationship with Frida, so magical in its early days, became a reflection of that dynamic. They could connect in the studio, but struggled in silence at home. Benny gave his most tender words to the keys. But when the music stopped, the connection broke. And he knew it. Years later, he would admit something quietly devastating. "I gave my best lines to the songs, not to the people who needed to hear them from me." He wasn't hiding from people. He was hiding from himself. By the early 80s, ABBA's internal tension wasn't a powder keg. It was a slow burn, and Benny felt it. The joy that once poured effortlessly through the speakers began to dry up. The studio, once a sanctuary, started to feel cold. He described it as creative exhaustion. Not rage, not betrayal, just silence. The kind that creeps in slowly, until you don't even notice the music has stopped. But Benny noticed. He remembers the exact moment he realized it was over, not with a fight or an argument, but with a feeling. It just didn't sound honest anymore. And so, he let it go. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't feel it anymore. What the public saw was a band stepping away gracefully. But behind closed doors, Benny felt the collapse like a death. Not a group, but of his emotional home. And he didn't grieve loudly. He just stopped writing for a while. And in that silence, he began to realize something that would change how he saw everything that came before. He hadn't been chasing fame. He had been chasing connection. And now, he had neither. But the real tragedy wasn't that ABBA ended. It was what Benny did next, and what he didn't do, that finally forced him to confront the pain he had buried for decades. When the lights went down on ABBA, Benny Andersson didn't disappear. He dissolved into silence. No interviews, no solo spotlight, just a quiet retreat from the very thing that once gave him purpose. But the silence wasn't peace. It was numbness. Because for Benny, ABBA wasn't just a band. It was where he felt, where he lived. And now, without the structure of albums, deadlines, and emotional translation through melodies, he had nowhere to go with the feelings that had built up across a decade. He thought walking away would free him. Instead, it left him hollow. Frida, his former partner, moved on quickly. She reinvented herself, found new paths, reclaimed space. But Benny? He stayed stuck in the echoes. Not because he couldn't move on, but because he wasn't sure who he was without the music or what to do with the version of himself that never learned to speak outside of a song. He tried writing again, film scores, orchestral pieces, musicals, but none of it came easily. Because now, for the first time in his life, Benny had to face himself without a melody to mask the feeling. And that's when something unexpected happened. He stopped writing for applause and started writing for recovery. Projects like Christina, Fran de Vemela weren't just creative experiments. They were therapy. Deep, dramatic, emotionally vast scores that forced Benny to sit with feelings instead of just producing them. He began working with orchestras, taking long walks in silence, mentoring young musicians not just in harmony and rhythm, but in emotional truth. Because he'd learned something the hard way. You can only avoid vulnerability for so long. And when it finally catches up, it does knock. It floods everything. Through this slow process of artistic excavation, Benny found something he hadn't known he was missing. His own voice. Not the voice of the band. Not the polished pop structure with hooks and refrains. But something slower, sadder, honest. And for the first time in years, he started to reflect, not just on the music, but on the cost of it all. He admitted publicly that many of ABBA's most beloved songs were never meant to be happy. The contrast, the bright melodies with melancholic undertones, was entirely intentional. Because that's how he felt. People think our songs were joyful, he said once. But there's always a sadness underneath. And that sadness wasn't fictional. It was Benny's emotional fingerprint. The proof was everywhere. Listen to Knowing Me, Knowing You, and you'll hear it. The ache hiding beneath the harmony. The subtle heartbreak wrapped in perfect choruses. That duality wasn't an accident. It was a lifeline. Music for Benny was always about creating a place safe enough to feel and safe enough to not feel, depending on the day. It was both armor and mirror. But for years, the world didn't see that. Because Benny was always labeled the cold brain of the band. The technician, the arranger, the quiet genius behind the glass. He hated that label because it made him sound robotic. Detached, like he was playing with wires, not wounds. But Benny wasn't cold. He was contained. He had to be, because if he ever let the full weight of what he felt rise to the surface, he feared it would drown him. And in some ways it did. He's since confessed that some of his deepest regrets aren't about what was said, but what wasn't. He didn't fight for Frida. He didn't open up to Bjorn. He didn't tell Agnetha how much her voice meant to him, not as a singer, but as a vessel for his buried feelings. He let the music do the talking. And now, at 78, he admits, the songs reached millions. But sometimes I wonder if they ever reached the people who needed to hear them most. That quiet confession reframes everything. Because it means ABBA wasn't built on perfect harmony. It was built on pain, on distance, on the desperate, delicate attempt to stay connected without being too exposed. And maybe that's why it worked. Because the very fragility they tried to hide was the thing that made their music so deeply human. There's something else Benny talks about now, something that took him decades to understand. He says ABBA was never a fairy tale. It was a survival story for people navigating love, loss, pressure, and identity in the public eye, using music as both a shield and a confession. The reason the world connected with those songs wasn't because they were perfect. It was because they were real. Because behind the hooks were hearts that didn't always know how to speak. And behind every joyous chorus was a chord change that quietly said, "I'm not okay." That was Benny's gift and his burden. Because the man who gave the world some of the most beloved melodies of all time spent most of his life feeling unheard. And the world's perception of him, technical, distant, genius, but emotionless, only deepened that isolation. He wasn't cold. He was afraid of what might come out if he ever stopped writing long enough to feel. So he didn't stop until everything stopped for him. And when it did, the silence was deafening, but was also honest. And that honesty, it started to change him, not publicly, not with headlines or tabloid reinventions, but quietly in the background, where Benny had always lived. He began mentoring, not as a celebrity, but as a teacher, He told young musicians not to chase hits, but to chase truth, to write what scared them, to sit with their feelings, to not wait until they were 70 before they started being real. It was the advice he wished someone had given him, and perhaps it was his way of making peace with the past. But that peace wasn't total, because no matter how far he's come, one part of the story still lingers. Not the breakups, not the fame, but the quiet collapse that ended everything. The moment when the music just stopped meaning something, and he couldn't fake it anymore. By the early 1980s, something was off. The magic that once flowed between chords and choruses felt strained, manufactured, like a performance of something they no longer believed in. Benny Andersson felt it first. It wasn't a blowout fight or a dramatic break. It was quieter than that. Subtle. A missing spark in the studio. A growing numbness. He remembers walking into a session and realizing no one wanted to be there. Not even him. ABBA's end didn't come with slammed doors or bitter press statements. It came with silence, unspoken fatigue, a loss of emotional truth. The music, so alive, so honest in its early days, had become something else. Something careful, strategic, hollow. And for Benny, who had spent his life chasing feeling, that was the beginning of the end. He once said, "The music stopped being honest, and I couldn't lie through songs." That's how ABBA died. Not in scandal, but in slow, quiet exhaustion. They were still topping charts, still adored by fans, still icons, but inside they were ghosts of themselves. Buert had already moved on, emotionally and musically. Agnetha was visibly done, retreating from the stage, the interviews, the flash. Frida has still fought for the magic, but even she knew it was gone. And Benny? He was holding on out of guilt. Guilt that maybe if he pushed harder, tweaked one more harmony, rewrote one more chorus, he could bring it all back. But deep down, he knew you can't force a song that isn't there. And worse, he didn't miss ABBA's success. He missed what it used to feel like. The joy of collaboration, the thrill of discovery, the emotional honesty before the fame distorted it. So when the group quietly faded in 1982, Benny didn't fight it. He let it go, not because he was ready, but because pretending was no longer possible. Still, the aftermath wasn't freedom. It was a kind of paralysis, because for the first time in his adult life, Benny Andersson had no deadlines, no partners, no one to translate his silence into sound. And that silence? It haunted him for years. He once admitted he didn't even touch a piano for nearly a year after ABBA ended, because every key was a reminder of what was lost. Not just the band, but the connection, that strange, fragile link between emotion and sound that had kept him sane for so long. And when that link broke, Benny wasn't sure who he was anymore. He tried working on new projects, film scores, stage musicals, symphonic work. And though brilliant, they felt distant, because nothing, absolutely nothing, could replicate what ABBA had given him. A safe place to feel, a place where his music meant something to someone else. And that's when the true collapse happened. Not publicly, but internally. Benny began reflecting not on what he had achieved, but what it had cost him. He confessed, years later, that the end of ABBA felt like a creative death. Not because he couldn't write anymore, but because he couldn't feel the need to write. He'd spent so long turning emotion into melody that he'd forgotten how to process emotion without a melody. And now, there was nothing to translate. The well had run dry, and it forced Benny to ask himself a terrifying question. If I'm not writing for ABBA, who am I writing for? That question sat with him for a long time, until he realized maybe he didn't have to write for anyone anymore. Maybe he could just write for himself. That shift, small, invisible, deeply personal, was the start of Benny's quiet reinvention. He didn't reemerge with a big solo album or a flashy comeback. He returned through the back door, by mentoring, by composing slowly, patiently, without the pressure of sales or spotlight. He scored projects with deep emotional themes, created orchestral suites that no pop chart would ever touch, wrote for theater, not for fame. And in those quiet rooms, he began to feel again, not the thrill of adoration, but the weight of honesty, the kind of emotional truth that used to scare him. And this time, he didn't run from it, because something had changed. He no longer needed to be understood by the world. He just needed to understand himself. He also began looking back, reevaluating the legacy of ABBA, not through the lens of fame, but through the lens of humanity. He admitted things that would have once terrified him. That ABBA was never built on joy. It was built on escape. It was for people searching for something to hold on to. And in the end, they held on to the music because they couldn't always hold on to each other. That honesty reframed everything. The glamour, the tours, the headlines, they were all masks. What mattered was the music that made people feel, because that's what it did for them too. Benny now says, "We weren't a fairy tale. We were four people trying not to fall apart. The music was the only thing holding us together. And when the music stopped, so did they. But the legacy didn't. ABBA songs have never faded. They've only grown. And for Benny, that's bittersweet. Because the very music that once masked his pain is now how the world celebrates him. But there's one part of the story that few people know. One thing that Benny never says in interviews, but you can see in his eyes when he plays those old melodies. He's still writing, but not to be heard. He's writing to feel. And maybe, finally, that's enough. Today at 78, Benny Andersson walks a little slower. He talks more softly, smiles a little easier, and when he plays, he lets the silence last a beat longer than he used to. Not because he's lost his touch, but because he finally understands its weight. Silence, for Benny, used to be frightening. It meant feelings he couldn't process, questions he couldn't answer, regrets he didn't want to face. But now, silence is where the truth lives. Because somewhere along the way, Benny stopped chasing perfect songs and started chasing something else. Peace. It didn't come from awards, or applause, or sold-out arenas. It came from honesty, from finally looking at his life, not as a discography, but as a story. A fragile, beautiful, and often painful story about a boy with an accordion who used music to say what he couldn't say out loud. And for the first time in his life, he's not afraid to tell it. In recent interviews, Benny speaks with a kind of calm acceptance that was once unimaginable. He talks openly about his flaws, his detachment, his silence. He even calls himself a difficult man to love. But he says it with no shame, just truth. He reflects on ABBA not as an icon or a legacy, but as a mirror, a place where four very human people tried to make sense of themselves and accidentally created something that made the world feel seen. He laughs at the fairy tale now, at the glitter and perfection people projected onto them, because it was never about that. It worked, he says, because we were broken. That's the part no one ever understood. The strength of ABBA wasn't in how polished they looked. It was in how fragile they were beneath the surface. And Benny? He was the most fragile of them all. Not because he cried easily, but because he didn't. He internalized everything. Turned every emotion into chord progressions. Hid every fear behind strings and harmonies. And now he knows the cost. His greatest regret isn't a missed opportunity or a failed project. It's the people who loved him and didn't always know if he loved them back, because he showed it through songs, but rarely with words. He once said, "I gave the world my heart, but I forgot to give it to the people next to me." That quiet sentence says more than any biography ever could, because it's not about fame, it's about being known. And for decades, Benny Andersson felt seen only through his music, not as a man, not as a partner, not as a father or friend, just as a sound. But now, in his late 70s, something has shifted. He's no longer writing to escape. He's writing to reflect. He's mentoring young artists with a different lesson than the one he learned. He tells them, don't just write to be clever, write to be clear, write what you're scared of, because he's finally realized music is powerful, but it can also be a wall. And for most of his life, he built walls instead of bridges. But now he's building bridges with old bandmates, with family, with himself. ABBA reunited quietly in recent years, not for spectacle, but for closure. Their album Voyage wasn't about reliving youth. It was about finally being honest, about letting time do what it does best, soften the edges. And Benny, who once carried the silent weight of the band, is no longer burdened by it. He doesn't need to fix everything. He doesn't need to be the glue. He just needs to be present. When asked what ABBA means to him now, Benny doesn't talk about fame or numbers or records sold. He says one thing: it was where I learned how to feel.